Hi everyone, welcome to another Sharewise webinar. I am your host, Caitlin Chung, and today we're joined by Echoiq, known on the ASX as EIQ. And we have here today with us the COO, Philip Woolff, and the Chief Commercial Officer, Deon Strydom. Thank you so much both for joining me today.
Thanks, Caitlin. It is a pleasure to join you on Sharewise and to bring everybody up to speed on what's going on in the world of Echoiq.
Yes, so today, Philip and Deon will do a presentation for us, and then following that, we'll do a Q&A. So for those that have joined us live, please feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A box down below, and then we'll get to them at the end. But I'll hand it off to you guys.
Great. Thanks, Caitlin. Well, hello again, everybody. As Caitlin said, we are from Echoiq. Our ticker symbol on the ASX is EIQ. And essentially, we are a business around early warning and enhanced detection for heart disease. As with any presentation of this type, I would draw your attention to standard ASX disclaimers around forward-looking statements. Most of you will be familiar with that, I'm sure. And before we really kick into the sort of gist of the presentation, just a little bit of a corporate snapshot on Echoiq. So we have got about 495 million shares on issue. Recent share price is around 17 cents, which puts our market capitalization at around $84 million. At the end of the last quarter, we held a little under $1.7 million cash at bank. We hold no long-term debt, and our sort of average cash burn really, when we incorporate R&D tax rebates that we've received, is around $400,000 a month. We've indicated that we expect around $2.2 million in options conversions to generate that level of cash by the end of this month. We're on track for that. And of course, another big inflow for us will really be our R&D rebate, which we'd expect to be close to the R&D rebate that we secured last year, which was, as I said, 1.2 million. And that puts us in a reasonable position and a fairly comfortable position cash-wise. Our business is widely held in some regards, about 1,500 shareholders overall. The board and top 20 holders hold around 50%. So these are long-term committed investors in our business. They are very understanding of where we're going and very supportive shareholders. You can see the composition of our board here. It includes our executive chair, Andrew Grover, 3 non-executive directors, and our company secretary. So to move forward and really kick off, I guess like any business, we really look at what problem are we trying to solve? And we're really looking at the problem of diagnosis around cardiovascular disease. So diseases of the heart are the leading cause of death worldwide. It kills more than any other set of conditions. And although treatment options are improving, accurate diagnosis remains extremely complicated. And the issue is that delayed or misdiagnoses and treatment costs lives. And a few statistics for viewers really at the bottom. 30% of all deaths worldwide are attributed to cardiovascular disease. A recent study in Australia, in fact, showed that 50% of people with heart valve diseases don't even know they've got them. And the issue around that particularly is that some of them have extremely high mortality rates. And we'll get onto that in a little more detail in a couple of slides. And so we talk about the challenges in diagnosis, and I think it's a good place to start looking at exactly how do these conditions get diagnosed. And you can see on the image there in the middle, this is an image of a woman receiving a transthoracic echocardiogram. And that's a bit of a mouthful, but it's really an ultrasound of the heart captured using sound waves. Ultrasounds are used widely for all sorts of things. You'll be familiar with pregnancy scans, for example, and this is very similar. It is an ultrasound of the heart. And in this image, we see the sonographer sitting at the echo cart And from a series of moving images, still images are captured, and from those images, a series of measurements are captured. And an echocardiogram really is the most widely used tool in the diagnosis of structural heart disease. And when we say structural heart disease, we're talking about diseases of the heart muscle and its chambers and its valves itself. And it's widely used, it's relatively affordable. These machines are widely accessible. And if you go to your GP and the GP suspects some kind of issue with the heart itself, you will most likely be sent for an echocardiogram. In Australia, it is the #1 Medicare item in the country. So this is widely used. In the US, it's estimated that more than 30 million echocardiograms are performed each year. So all well and good. The problem in this space, though, is that when cardiologists are really reviewing all of these measurements, they are often looking for multiple conditions at once. So a number of conditions share similar symptoms and features. So this might start with somebody who says, look, I'm feeling out of breath rather sooner than I used to be. And there'll be a discussion around whether or not that's just a normal sign of aging or if there's something else going on. The problem with that is lots of conditions share breathlessness, for example, as a symptom. So when a cardiologist is reviewing these numbers, they're often looking for a number of conditions at one time. Another challenge in this space is that certain conditions have what we call misleading indicators. So you might present a series of symptoms, but there can sometimes be a measurement in there that can kind of throw reviewers off the scent. And so this is another reason why it's quite complicated to get a really clear diagnosis around a number of conditions. And to make matters worse, there are certain conditions that see women much more likely to be misdiagnosed than men. And there are a number of theories around that. They can include physiological reasons, but also issues around bias. Typically, when I say to people, imagine somebody who is 65 years old, carrying some extra weight, reporting breathlessness, often people's minds will imagine a man in that situation when it is in fact just as likely to be a woman in that situation. And we'll talk about a study that we performed that really highlighted this fact. So we've got a very complicated diagnostic landscape, and essentially Echoiq as a business is really using artificial intelligence and access to world-leading cardiac big data to help healthcare professionals obtain earlier, more accurate, automated diagnoses for structural heart disease. So we are really there to help diagnosticians identify disease accurately and quickly. That is what we are about as a business. And so when we look at, as a company, what are the real sort of sources of strength for us? At the middle there on this slide, you will see that we're really starting to offer a broad structural heart solution. We'll talk about it, but we've done a lot of work around aortic stenosis, which is a leading form of heart valve disease. And increasingly, we're looking at heart failure, which is a different form of structural heart disease. On the top right, the work we do is clinically validated. So establishing clinical credibility is extremely important in the medtech space. We've completed a US study demonstrating 100% accuracy in the detection of guideline-defined severe aortic stenosis. We've had an extremely interesting Australian study, which I will go through with viewers shortly. I mentioned that our work is backed by cardiac big data. So Echoiq enjoys exclusive AI access to the National Echo Database of Australia, NEDA. And this is really a database full of anonymized records of echocardiographic measurements. We believe it is the world's largest of its type, and it really allows us to train and develop models on more than 200 million data points. It's an enormous database. There are 37 contributing hospitals towards that database. We have taken a a fairly rigorous regulatory approach. So we are pursuing FDA clearance for our solutions. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides. And finally, there's the user experience. So we talk about that great complexity that diagnosticians face, and we are really making this computing power and this capability available to people in a number of different formats. It can include alerts if somebody hits a certain guideline, or we detect high risk for something, and there are various implementation models. So I mentioned aortic stenosis, and aortic stenosis is really where Echoiq started its focus. Aortic stenosis is a common form of heart valve disease. In fact, the aortic valve is often called the gateway to the heart. It's an extremely important valve. And stenosis just means stiffening. And over time, the aortic valve can become stiffer, usually due to calcification. And this valve fails at that point to open beautifully and fails to close beautifully. And that can cause enormous pressure on parts of the heart. It can cause imbalance in the heart. And you can imagine, much like a bicycle tire that is really overfilled with air, the pressure that that puts on the tire itself. And in many ways, a heart that is not performing properly can behave in a similar fashion. You can then imagine why people are actually feeling these symptoms. And it really manifests itself physically on how people are feeling. And so aortic stenosis is really fatal when left untreated. And fortunately, there are treatments for this. The main treatment for aortic stenosis is a replacement valve, an artificial valve. And this surgery used to be done through open heart surgery, which is really quite massive surgery with long recovery times and hugely invasive. But increasingly, this surgery is done using the transcatheter method. So it's a small device that is actually inserted up through one of the sort of veins in the body, one of the arteries in the body, into the heart. Recovery is relatively quick. People are up and about within a day or so. Many people are back at work within 2 or 3 days. So it is life-changing for people who have got aortic stenosis. The key is getting it early enough and identifying it in the first place. The speed is important because you'll see on those statistics on the top right there, 50% 2-year mortality rate when untreated. So if you've got severe aortic stenosis and you do not receive a replacement valve, you have a 50% chance of not surviving 2 years. At 5 years, you have a pretty much 100% chance of no longer being alive. So capturing this accurately and early is critical. And that's really the kind of thing that EchoSolve is really designed to do. To give you a sense of how widespread this is, 1.5 million people in the US alone have aortic stenosis, and it's responsible for about $10 billion in healthcare spending right now. Perhaps just as interestingly, people with underdiagnosed aortic stenosis, so that's aortic stenosis where it's felt to be less severe than it really is, are estimated to account for an extra 11 days in hospital each year. And when you think about the costs associated with people being in hospital who might not be there otherwise if they were receiving appropriate treatment at the right time, you can start to understand the economic impact of really helping to close this gap. And so for us as a business, really, we developed our AI algorithm that really identifies risk around aortic stenosis in 2021. We then spent the next year or so really securing clinical study, understanding of the impact of that algorithm in those kinds of settings. We completed a US reader study earlier this year, and we were pleased to announce in May that we have submitted our AI solution for aortic stenosis with the FDA. And we expect, all things going well, a response to that in August, and we're obviously fairly advanced on that time frame. So it's quite an exciting time for us, and we remain cautiously optimistic that that is going to yield a really positive result for us. If we look at the kind of product that we deliver and make available to practitioners, it is software, and it is software that really removes the labor intensiveness, user dependency, and unconscious bias in diagnosis. So this is designed to lead to greater accuracy compared to traditional methods. And I've got a few statistics on the impact of that. At the bottom there, you can really see a number of the features of the software, but it's really designed to be a super easy to read dashboard, giving healthcare professionals a view of risk, and it's really assessing all of those echocardiographic measurements. So instead of somebody manually going through them, looking for that needle in a haystack, our software is really automating that assessment. It is doing it quickly, it is doing it consistently. And really, it is designed to be an extra pair of eyes for heart care teams and cardiology teams. I've got a case study to share with you, and this was really a clinical study that we performed at St Vincent's. Many Australian viewers will be familiar with St Vincent's. We ran this across 2 sites in St Vincent's, Sydney and Melbourne, and these are great internationally renowned hospitals, particularly in the world of cardiology. So this study saw over 9,000 patient records, again anonymized but analyzed. This study was funded by a very large company called Edwards Life Sciences. Edwards are the world's leading producers of replacement aortic valves. And so companies like this are very interested in technologies that really improve accurate diagnosis and really support faster, more accurate decision-making in the space. They are the providers of the therapies that really have an impact on life outcomes for people with these conditions. And so what were the key findings of this study? Well, the key finding studies were that out of those 9,000 patients, when the heart care teams reviewed those patients themselves, they identified 218 patients that they defined as having severe aortic stenosis. And bear in mind, those 9,000 patients were sent for an echo for all sorts of reasons. So, of course, not all of them had aortic stenosis. Some of them had other conditions. Some of them were perfectly fine. But they had identified 218 patients meeting that condition. When we ran EchoSolve over that data, we actually found, and the study confirmed, that 376 patients actually had severe aortic stenosis, a 72% increase. Furthermore, EchoSolve identified another 174 patients who were at high risk of death from aortic stenosis, even if they hadn't quite met that threshold. So you can see enormously, we've got a huge increase in the number of patients, being accurately identified with severe guideline-defined aortic stenosis, but an even bigger group who were really worthy of further review or prioritization in care because of the risk that they were exhibiting. And I mentioned gender bias earlier on in the discussion, and in this study, we actually found that women were 66% more likely than men to have been misdiagnosed in the first place. And EchoSolve really corrects for those gaps in gender imbalance in diagnosis. The system is taking many more measurements into account and is really assessing that, is really automating that assessment. So some pretty impactful results from that study. In fact, 2 weeks ago, a presentation was made at a scientific summit at New York Valves. My colleague Deon on the call was actually present at the presentation in New York at the time, so that was June the 5th and 7th. And this was a presentation made by one of the leading hospital groups in the United States, a group with 50 hospitals in Texas, and they had used EchoSolve in a similar fashion. And they also found increases in detection using the software, and they drew some fairly compelling conclusions around the potential impact for that kind of software in a clinical setting. So that was extremely exciting for us to be featured in that way, and we're very proud of that. Our thoughts are also now turning to heart failure. Heart failure is a complex syndrome that leads to ill health, risk of death, and high costs of care. It affects more than 60 million people worldwide. And interestingly, it's not only the leading cause of hospitalization in the over 65s, it is the number one cause of rehospitalization overall. And decreasing the impact of heart failure has become a major global public health priority. Unlike aortic stenosis, which requires a replacement valve, heart failure is typically treated by relatively affordable drug therapies and/or lifestyle changes. So a slightly different picture on the economics. What is interesting, though, is that when you look at the rehospitalization rate, 30%, 25% of people with heart failure who get discharged from hospital with heart failure are readmitted within a month. Often these readmissions are emergency presentations, ambulances, full emergency crews at the hospitals. This is an extremely expensive form of care. So making sure that people are getting on the right drugs or the right treatment regimes early enough is absolutely critical to keeping these healthcare costs under control. And again, you actually see some opportunities for solutions like Echoiq, and my colleague Deon will talk a little bit about insurance and reimbursement, and you can see really where that comes from when you look at it within this context. So before I hand over to Deon, very quickly, I'm just going to say what heart failure is. And one of the problems with heart failure in terms of diagnosis is more than half the patients currently don't actually walk out from their diagnostic session with a definitive diagnosis. It's actually quite difficult to identify. And with Echoiq, what we're able to do is we're able to stratify risk for all patients who are going in for heart failure review. And we're increasing the number of people with the definitive review, and we're stratifying that. So it really allows practitioners to understand who to prioritize for treatment and review and who not to prioritize, or who to say, look, you don't need my help right now, go on about your day. And that is extremely valuable information. Before I hand over, really, I'll just talk about where we go from here with heart failure. So we've got a very clearly mapped out pathway to clearance. And when we say clearance, we're talking about FDA clearance. So it is our intention to seek FDA clearance for our AI algorithm for heart failure, just as we have done for aortic stenosis. This slide really maps out some of those timeframes. So under 12 months from when we really kicked that off. So I think we'd expect something early next year in that kind of space. So just to give viewers a sense of that. And I think I'll hand over to Deon, who's going to really talk to us a bit about the commercialization.
Thank you, Philip. So with regards to commercialization, our core focus on the commercialization approach is around reimbursement. So this is where our hospital or facility will get paid for using our technology. And so the typical reimbursement, or the anticipated reimbursement for aortic stenosis, is around the $68 mark. And then the agreement we have with that facility is with a revenue share agreement, where Echoiq will receive anything between 15 and 30%. We're obviously aiming at around the 25% as a ballpark figure to start with. And that is a revenue share agreement. So what that results in is a frictionless sale for the hospital. So all of a sudden, from being a cost center for them, they can actually generate revenue from the procedure. There are around 5 million echoes done each year for aortic stenosis. And then if you scroll across and look at heart failure, the reimbursement rate is significantly higher. So this is around 284. There's a predicate device for that already. And the reason that this reimbursement is so much higher is pretty much based on what Philip mentioned earlier. The 30-day readmission rate for hospitals is really high, around 25%. And the penalties for hospitals for 30-day readmission rates is up to 3% of the revenue. So absolutely, they want to find these patients earlier, and they want to make sure that the right patients are treated. As Phil mentioned as well, I was in the US, returned back earlier this week, and the revenue share model is a model that the hospitals and facilities understand, and one that they're very comfortable in participating in. So on the next slide, then you'll also see, Phil, if you don't mind, our other way to market is through licensing. There are three clear groups that we can license with. So these are firstly the device manufacturers, the manufacturers of the valve, as Phil mentioned. You then got the major pharmaceutical companies who do the drugs, and then the hardware producers. So these are the likes of your GE, Philips, Siemens, where the technology can be integrated within the device. So the purpose of our visit to the US was to catch up with most of these players. There is significant interest in helping to automate cardiovascular diagnosis. There's a lot of AI right now that focuses on automatic capture of images, but there's very few, if any, that actually focuses on the interpretation of the diagnosis. And that's where we come in and Echoiq comes in. So a typical deal with this will be something like a sign-up bonus. That's then followed by your typical milestones, which would be on FDA clearances or identification of a new condition or a new disease state. You have to keep in mind, for someone like the device manufacturers or the pharmaceutical companies, the easiest way for them to increase their revenue is to increase the diagnosis. So they don't have to go and do extra studies to go and do a new drug or a new device. If they can just increase the diagnosis, that's the easiest way for them to increase their revenues. These agreements are also often tied to market share, where the payment is tied to whatever percentage we can show has been uplift based on the usage of the AI. That's what a typical deal would look like. And as I mentioned, we're in advanced discussions. And then on the next slide, if you want to think about some of the investment highlights and what you can look forward to, we've got exclusive access to Netta. Whenever we mention Netta in the US, this is unheard of. The size of the database and the fact that multiple hospitals from multiple sites have agreed to collate the information, it just doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. So it's a really unique database and a really big advantage for Echoiq. Our FDA application is now only a few weeks away from hopefully getting our clearance. We're very optimistic that will be a good outcome. And then what we have been able to do with heart failure is we've learned all the lessons from aortic stenosis. So we can really fast track the heart failure model. So that can all be wrapped up within, the timeline is around 12 months. And then cardiovascular disease is not going away. I mean, everyone knows this. It's getting bigger and bigger. Having just been to the US, they've got a big problem. Australia is not far behind, and this is a global condition. So a really big TAM for the company to be participating in. And then we're really fortunate to have a very, very strong advisory board. On the next slide, Phil, you will see who our advisory board members are. So these are all the who's who of cardiology and AI across the US and the UK. Amongst them, they've got more than 1,200 peer-reviewed papers. And the reason they're on our advisory board is twofold. Number one is they absolutely believe in the technology and what we are bringing to the market. So these people can go anywhere, they can work anywhere. And so they're supporting our cause because they absolutely believe in that. And the second part is Professor Jeff Strange and Professor David Playford, who's our Chief Research and Strategy Officer and Chief Medical Officer, are very well published and very well renowned in this space. So those are the reasons that we've been able to attract the caliber of advisory board that we have. So Caitlin, with that, I think we'll hand back to you. If there are any questions, both my Phil and self will be more than happy to answer those.
Thank you so much, both of you. That was a really, really good presentation. And it was really interesting to learn about what you guys are doing. For those that have joined us midway through, please feel free to pop your questions into the chat. But I'll get us started. So before we dive any deeper, I just want to clarify. So the software itself, does it connect to that Echo machine, which you were talking about?
So it can, but it doesn't need to. So the software can run based on extracted data, or it can be integrated. It really just depends on the site. Okay,
I see. And so these people that are diagnosing can just use the software on their computer. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. All right.
Can I quickly add something there, Caitlin? So the real thing that we try to focus on when we build the technology is to make sure that it fits within the workflow. We knew with any extra step that this will become too difficult to implement, right? So no matter how they use it, whether it's on a handheld POCUS device or a big machine, we integrate with all of those, and there's no additional step. At the time that they do the diagnosis, it sends the measurements back to a cloud. We then, within 3 seconds, send them the results back. So this is completely seamless from an integration perspective and from a workflow perspective. There's no additional steps required or no special equipment required to be able to implement our software.
Wow, okay. And so when you guys do get started with commercialization, I assume you have so much data. That would be collected through these diagnoses, right? Would you ever consider using this data to help further your studies, which you guys are very, obviously invested in?
No.
Yeah, okay.
So there's clear separation between the data that we use to build our models and the data that we analyze for commercial or research use. They're very separate. And in fact, on that subject, there is a lot of artificial intelligence that is continually updating itself. In fact, it's learning based on everything you run through the model. And our models are fixed, so we don't do that. Our models are fixed, they are closed. Machine learning is complete, and the solution really is designed to assess the information we've got and to serve up that assessment of risk, and it's gone, it's done. So clear separation for us.
Okay.
And another thing on that as well, the accuracy of our software is 98.6%. So trying to use extra data to try and refine that makes no sense. It's a closed system, data is locked, and we're very comfortable that the accuracy is there to support commercial uptake.
Yeah, okay. And speaking of AI, I know it's still lots of people are still very skeptical about it, right? So what would you say to investors that are interested but are still a bit, standoffish?
Deon, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll actually give you a comment that I was at New York Bell just 2 weeks ago, and one of the questions that they asked to the chairperson was, "Do you believe that AI will replace cardiologists?" And the comment that she made was very insightful. She said, "No, AI won't replace cardiologists, but AI will replace cardiologists who refuse to use AI."
Wow.
So you see this all the time in dermatology, in radiology, everybody uses AI. So we're not there to replace the physician in any way, shape, or form. We're there to help give them a second opinion that they can go, "I agree with that diagnosis," or actually I now want to look a little bit deeper based on what the AI has flagged for me. This is a very time-consuming thing to do for cardiologists, and it's just humanly impossible to read all those numbers and get it accurate every single time. The AI doesn't get tired. The AI is consistent every single time, and it allows them to then just spend a bit of extra time to delve a bit deeper if they want to, or to confirm the diagnosis. But AI is here to stay. It's not going away. You're going to just see increases in it in medical.
Okay. And so since you've mentioned that there's a very, very high accuracy rate, right? So is there still a need in future for you guys to invest into further studies then?
From my aortic stenosis perspective, I'd say no, that's been done. But from a heart failure perspective, absolutely. So the first way we establish credibility in the market is through scientific credibility. So you have to be able to prove that the AI works. So we'll take a similar approach with heart failure that we've done with aortic stenosis. But so I can't see any further studies around efficacy or accuracy of the technology for aortic stenosis. What you will see is we are now currently doing some studies with an organization to show what additional revenue they could generate from implementing the AI. Because you have to remember, once they do a valve replacement, these are high margin procedures for them. And if they can increase those procedures, the hospitals are really interested in that. And we're sitting out in a clinical trial to prove what additional revenue a facility can generate from having this software on site.
Okay. We have a question here. What was Edwards' assessment of the fully funded clinical trial outcomes from the study beginning in 2021?
So they absolutely they were surprised by the findings. Number one, as they all knew that this was happening in the industry, but they didn't know the scale of it. So they are super keen to continue conversations with us because, once again, as I mentioned, the easiest way for them to increase the diagnosis or increase sales of valves is to increase the diagnosis. So we're in active conversation with them. And yeah, we might even have 1 or 2 pilot sites in the future where we test that alongside Edwards or any other valve manufacturers for that case to show a hospital what additional revenue they can generate from that. So Edwards is speaking to us frequently about the potential about doing something together, as is a number of others.
Okay, thank you for that. And so beyond the US market then, are there any other regions where you guys think could be potential opportunities?
So absolutely, places like Europe will be of interest to us, right? And typically the way you approach Europe is by tiering it. So you'll start with your English-speaking European countries first, and then go tier 2, tier 3. So all of those are opportunities for us. And in full disclosure, it's not a focus for us right now. We laser focused at commercializing in the US. And even within the US, we're not going broad and doing all the states. We're focusing on the top 10 to 15 states first to get good penetration, and then we expand. So is Europe of interest? Absolutely, but it's not short-term interest. We want to make sure we can really integrate well within the US before we look at those other markets.
Okay, and actually now that's a good time to answer this question. To clarify, in which countries is Echoiq being trialed now apart from Australia and US? So am I correct that it's just the US then?
Just the US. It's been cleared in New Zealand, because New Zealand's the easiest country to get something cleared in, but the focus is the US market. So we're not trying to do it anywhere else.
Okay. And so as the capabilities of AI expand, what's the company's strategic plan to capitalize on these opportunities?
There's a number of things that we suppose we could do. And the reason I'm smiling on this one is there's still a lot of internal debate. My personal view is that healthcare is moving closer to the consumer. And with the AI that we have, we've got a perfect vehicle or perfect platform to be able to do hard assessments closer to consumer at the consumer stage, right? There's AI right now that can take a novice person and get them to do an accurate echo, and that you can do that on your phone. And then the missing part of that is, well, what do I do with that information? So my view is there's a real play to go closer to the consumer. That hasn't been finalized or even confirmed internally, but that's certainly areas that I get excited about. But with AI in healthcare, the opportunities are endless. So the challenge for us is to remain focused on what we want to do first, and then look at what else is on the table. But yeah, there are multiple opportunities with AI in healthcare.
Yeah, it's very rapidly expanding, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, well, final question. What are the key milestones for investors to watch in the next 6 months, including potential partnerships and revenue generation?
You want to take that, Phil?
Sure. So look, we've talked very clearly about FDA. So I think that's something that we'd expect people to look forward to. I think people can look forward to significant advancement in our heart failure offering. That's going to become an extremely important part of Echoiq's business. We talked specifically about the scale of the opportunity there, the commercialization opportunity, particularly around heart failure as it relates to reimbursement, medical insurance, etc. I think people can expect to see some announcements around partnerships. So Deon really outlined, I think, some of those different potential licensing partnerships, whether that's hardware, whether that is therapy providers. And certainly as we get beyond FDA, I think that the impression and the impact that we can have on the space becomes ever clearer to people. And so I think there are a number of real milestones I think that people can expect to see from us in that space in the next 6 months.
Okay.
Sorry, Kate, to interrupt you. Commercial perspective, Kate, and I think there's four clear ones for me. The first one is obviously FDA clearance, right? As Phil mentioned, that's imminent. The second part is the reimbursement that we're expecting for our technology. The heart failure continuation of the heart failure product is really, really important, and then some licensing agreements. So to answer the question, when do we anticipate revenue? I'd say within the next 6 months, if all goes well within the reimbursement, that you can start expecting revenue for the shareholders.
Wow, okay. Well, thank you so much for that. Thank you for such a great presentation. Thank you for everyone that joined us and asked questions too. This will be posted onto our YouTube if you'd like to revisit it. But thank you so much, Philip and Deon, for your time.
Thanks, Caitlin. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having us.